Hi, my name is Josh White, and this is Globalists, the new podcast from the battleground. This week, we're discussing the Russia-Ukraine war and the latest developments there, and what the future might hold. And joining me is my co-host Mitchell Plitnick.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. There's actually been some really interesting developments, I think, in the Ukraine war, and they're complicated, I think, by events elsewhere in the world. So Ukraine has used its drone technology, and it of course famously has been defending itself with drones for quite some time, but it's really starting at the beginning of the year. They've taken a much more offensive sort of strategy that they've been using with their drones, and that works. As we've seen elsewhere in the world, that tends to work pretty well when you're going up against a superior military force. And indeed, it has worked well for Ukraine. And one of the things that I think is promising about this is that Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president, has, I think, wisely been trying to capitalize on this new advantage that he seems to have found, to call for renewed diplomacy. This I think stands in contrast with some of the ways he behaved early in the war, when Ukraine would seem to take some advantages and some steps forward. He tended more towards a maximalist position, and now he's saying, let's use this to start getting serious about ending the war and finding some arrangement. On the other side, Russia seems to be responding by escalating. They warned foreigners to leave Kyiv. Last night there was a huge barrage of missiles against Kyiv, Zaporizhia, and Kharkiv. They killed at least 11 people, wounded more than 100. And Russia has actually been using their hypersonic missiles, which is kind of a new twist. That's made a lot of headlines, and I think as a selective use of weaponry, that can be important for Russia. But I also think it shouldn't be overstated, because those are really expensive weapons. It's not like they can turn to the hypersonic missiles and use them the way Ukraine uses drones. Drones are cheap, and you can just send them and make lots and lots of them and target them. And if you do it cleverly, as Ukraine has been doing, particularly of late, really selecting your targets smartly. Ukraine has been damaging a lot of radar installations and a lot of other security sites that have kind of crippled some of Russia's targeting intelligence, and that's been a big deal. You can't do that with hypersonic missiles. You can only use them to a limited extent, but still, it's a relatively new piece of Russia's arsenal. In response to this escalation, unsurprisingly, Zelensky has called on the United States to send more Patriot missiles. And that's kind of complicated, because the United States has expended a lot of those Patriot missiles defending Israel in the war with Iran. Also some defending some of the Gulf states, and something like half the American supply is gone. And they're already talking about it'll take years to replenish. So it may not even be a case of, as it has been in the past, of the U.S. ignoring Ukraine so much as they really don't have the capacity to send them more Patriot missiles. So far, there's been no response from Washington, and I suspect that's why. It's kind of a sheepish, what do we say about this, because we haven't got the resources to send them. So, I think it's important for people who are sort of watching this. I mentioned it earlier that, and I think Zelensky is taking the right approach. There's been a tendency, whenever Ukraine seems to be turning the tide, to sort of suggest that, you go all in and you try to help Ukraine take back all the territory it's lost. I don't think that's realistic. I just don't. I don't think that's going to be possible. And I think that, this has happened a few other times. And as I said, I think Zelensky has wisely not gone towards a maximalist ambition. Instead, trying to he's set a quote unquote deadline. He's aiming to have the war over by the winter, and that's not unrealistic, given that he's now given Russia a really good incentive to end the war. You know, according to recent polls, 62% of Russians want to see this war ended. That's understandable, because for the first time, on top of the human losses, which have been very considerable, I mean, we talk about, a figure like 500,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. I mean, that's 500,000 families that have lost somebody. It matters. It has a real impact, and Putin is certainly feeling that impact. Now that's reinforced by the fact that Ukraine is actually striking inside Russia. They're striking Moscow. They're striking, Russian cities in a way they haven't before in this war. So it's not surprising that most Russians want to stand. And on the other side, a similar number of Ukrainians in another poll around the same time, just a few weeks ago, said they were willing to trade some territory for peace. Now, what exactly that means when actual terms get discussed, who knows? But there's clearly room on both sides for compromise, at least in terms of public opinion. That the Ukrainians are saying that the United States is going to send a delegation there to start up talks sometime in the next few weeks. It's a very vague sort of prediction, and it sounds like the kind of thing that you don't want to count on, especially with the Trump administration. But the truth of the matter is, I don't see any way that this gets resolved diplomatically without the United States in the middle. I don't see a broker that can do this besides the U.S. So we have to hope that somehow the Trump administration can find a way to try and make that happen, and can actually do something positive, which is not really in keeping with its track record.
No, indeed. Trump administration needs some wins, though, at this point, given the situation with Iran. And strangely, there are parallels here, even though they are radically different conflicts. But the kind of technological aspect of this, the asymmetry of weapons, Ukraine fighting off a much larger power with drones, there is a parallel there. As for the prospects for some sort of negotiated settlement, I mean, that was always the likely endpoint. It was just a matter of when, and that's still true. It will come down to, I think, political will on behalf of Russia and Ukraine and the United States. That's an obvious point. It's not obvious in my mind, however, that those things are all going to align, just because on the one hand you have a US administration that doesn't really know what it's doing, frankly. You have the Europeans who are kind of overstretched in terms of their diplomatic push, but at the same time they're kind of increasingly marginal to what's actually going on. I think Putin holds a lot of cards right now, and I could see the risk of him calculating, well, if I just keep going, I could probably get more territory. It's possible to see him calculating that. On the other hand, it's been going on for 4 years now. So it's possible that he'll look at the opinion polls in his own country and conclude, I should probably wrap this up and declare a great victory.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we've seen recently is, I mean, the Ukrainian success has largely been to stop the Russian advance, right? And that's been the form of Ukraine's success from the beginning of the war. I mean, the initial success that Ukraine had in this war was Russia thought it was going to be able to invade Ukraine, capture Kyiv, install a friendly government, and get this all done, in a matter of weeks. Clearly, that has proven not to be the case. And it was really fairly remarkable that Ukraine did that, because that was before they were getting a lot of help from the United States or from Europe. They were being supported, but not like anything like to the extent that they would be later on in the war. And now what we're seeing as a Ukrainian success is basically stopping Russia's advance again. I mean, Russia thought they could kind of grind on and eventually capture the whole Donbass region, and they're not moving forward. That's pretty clear. In fact, right, I know this has been one of the reasons people are noticing, at least here in the United States, that things are kind of turning, is that in recent weeks, Ukraine has actually taken a bit more territory back than it has lost. I don't expect that's going to continue, but just having done it is enough to put some diplomatic pressure, I think, on Putin. And again, we're kind of back to this place where Europe is solidly behind Ukraine. So that puts the United States in the position of having to be the one broker. No, Putin is not going to sit down with the European leaders and get have a legitimate back and forth. He needs the United States in the middle there. And honestly, this administration, as I just wrote in the Battleground, I think this week, this is a president that can't walk and chew gum at the same time. It's a serious problem. It sounds ridiculous. It sounds like a farce, and in a sense it is, but it's also a tragedy.
Principally for anyone who wants peace, right?
Oh, exactly. There's very little room to hope that the U.S. can or would be an effective broker here. At the same time, there are people in the Trump administration who aren't complete idiots. Not many, and most of them are, instead of being idiots, are sycophants. But if Trump tells them, go make a deal, go broker a deal, go use your knowledge and your understanding of the situation, and then if he does this the wise thing, which is unusual, which would be again out of character for him, but tells his people to work out the details, and I'll step in at the end, and we'll have the big ceremony, and I'll get all the credit, and that's how these things actually usually in normal administrations get done. So the issue right now is that I think we need to see the Ukrainians in particular really make the case to Washington to make that happen. Because, as you pointed out, the one thing about that is that Trump needs a win. And there's now an opportunity for him to have one. I don't think it would come in time for the midterms, which is why it's probably less appealing for him, because that's in November. And really, as Zelensky's chief of staff was just quoted this morning in Reuters saying that he really felt that a timetable of a diplomatic resolution by the winter would be realistic. That's not going to make it that's not going to quite make it for the midterms. But still, Trump needs a win, and that would certainly be a big one.
Definitely. From the UK perspective, things have changed dramatically over the last 4 years in that or rather there's a gap between the perception and the reality of the situation. Because from the start of this war, you had Boris Johnson in power, backing the Ukrainians to the hilt, seemingly, at least rhetorically. Although the UK has always been kind of evasive on committing troops, as has the rest of the Western Alliance, really. Yeah. And since we've shifted to Starmer, there was a great deal of hope when Starmer got in among his supporters, of whom I was not one, who believed that somehow Starmer and the European leaders, especially Macron, could somehow ensure a Ukrainian victory. And this is the kind of like liberal centre-left of British politics who see the Ukrainian cause as their kind of, what would be the phrase, kind of their major foreign policy issue right now, and have done for the last few years. And for many of them, it's more important than, say, the Israel-Palestine conflict. And from their point of view, the perspective, the correct position is to keep fighting until the whole of Ukraine is liberated. That's completely at odds with the reality on the ground right now, as you know. Even things like talking about Crimea right now are still very much on the minds of people who take this perspective. On the other hand, you have a great deal of leftists who I'd say are on the opposite end of the spectrum, who almost see a kind of lesser evil in Putin's Russia insofar as he's kind of a counterweight to US power, right? So there's very much a tension in British politics around Ukraine, and has been for a long time. And this is it kind of mirrors other tensions over Israel-Palestine in a strange way, with a lot of pro-Ukraine liberals being silent on Gaza, equally kind of like pro-Palestinian kind of tanky left that's completely absent on Ukraine. It's very few you meet. It's very rare to meet leftists who can kind of finesse this. Likewise, liberals who finesse this. And it's also mirrored on the right, I think. Although there's a very strange argument on the British far right about whether or not Ukraine or Russia is their cause, in quite crude terms, which I can only allude to, I suppose. You can imagine. So I feel like Starmer's position has moved to a place where, and it's the same for the rest of EU leaders, Germany, France, and so on, where they basically want an outcome that they can sign off on as, we have defended Ukraine, Ukraine has won, sort of, the war is over, yay, let's go home. So maybe there is a strange convergence of everyone just wanting this to be over.
I mean, one can certainly hope. That narrative sort of mirrors what happened here. I've been, and I will freely admit, I'm in the minority on this in the United States, but I believe that the Biden administration did not do all that it could have done to prevent this war in the first place. I think they kind of welcomed it in many ways in order as a way, and it succeeded if this was their idea, of basically rebuilding NATO, of making NATO relevant again. Which, and also with the goal of degrading Russia, which also has succeeded. Russia has expended, people power and munitions. They are, certainly not in a strong position right now in terms of American geostrategic thinking. So, that's my personal belief. And it is, of course, based on some real actions at the time. It's not just a guess. But be that as it may, once the war started and you have this sort of massive rallying around the flag, that, it became sort of almost outside of the really far left and the tankies, you really did not have very many people questioning support for Ukraine. And, I think there's many ways in which that's correct. Obviously, the invasion of Ukraine is absolutely unacceptable. It's a huge crime against international law, and more than that, it's an attack on international law in many ways, just as Israel, in its various ways, in its occupation over the years, and its impunity and its treatment of Gaza, we could go down a very long list, has undermined the foundations of international law. So did Russia. I mean, in the end, we can say, well, we oppose what Russia did, but Russia did it. Russia annexed Crimea. And that's not going to be reversed. It's not. It's going to stay that way. Some parts of eastern Ukraine are going to belong to Russia when this is all over. There's really no way around that. I don't see one. I don't see a realistic military option that brings back all the territory that Ukraine has lost. And that is a blow, a major blow to international law and order. It's a major blow to the foundations of the entire post-World War II system. So, that's that's happened. I mean, that's a thing now. There's no real reversing that. That being said, there is and has been all along, I think, a real problem with acknowledging the reality on the ground and striving for a diplomatic resolution rather than a military one, which was never realistic. So, and now in the United States, Ukraine is almost forgotten. In Europe, it's a much more immediate issue for the EU, especially, maybe less so for the UK, of course, but for the EU, it's much more of an immediate issue because, in theory, as the idea goes anyway, and I again don't think this is all that realistic, but the idea is that if Ukraine falls, the rest of Europe would be next, a la post World War II Soviet invasions of Eastern Europe. I don't think that's a real possibility for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that Putin himself has been reluctant to engage NATO. Now he's rattling the saber more because Ukraine has him a little bit more on the ropes. But I don't think that's really going to happen, but it certainly is a fear in Europe. There's no question about that. And the quote unquote accidental attack, which I don't think was so accidental, on Romania just a few days ago, certainly did not assuage those fears. So, but here, it's just not in the United States. It's just not thought of all that often anymore. It's not in the headlines that much. Partially because of Iran, but even before that, so much more of the focus was on Gaza and Israel. Potential for war with Iran, Trump in general. It has kind of taken a real backseat here, and that's going to be a problem because ultimately the United States has to be involved in resolving this. If it's not going to be involved in resolving it, it has to be involved in defending Ukraine. This is still where the weapons are going to come from for the most part. Germany has its capacity, but nothing like the United States. So, we have to hope that the U.S. somehow gets re-engaged in this in a positive direction because there's just no other choice. Even if, seeing the Trump administration involved is not maybe the best hope that one can have.
No, definitely not from the European perspective. But there is some truth in the kind of somewhat dodgy right-wing narrative that the Europeans have been living on kind of borrowed time and taking things a bit too complacently, betting that the US would always kind of back them up. And that's one of the ironies of the kind of continued support for NATO, especially in the discourse around Ukraine in Europe, in European countries, I should say. The EU is, of course, very clear in its position on NATO. But when it comes to UK politics, what you see is a left-right split. You see the populist right taking a Trumpian line, or aping a Trumpian line, I should say, whereas NATO membership and support is still kind of an unquestionable aspect of liberal centrist politics in the UK. But the irony is, if NATO had probably been wrapped up in the early 90s, like the Warsaw Pact, we might have some kind of independent policy in the EU and in the UK that would actually position us better, both to help the Ukrainians and also to, say, push for peace and have more leverage independent of the United States. And that's a great irony in all of this.
I think that kind of raises the question, because if there is, as Zelensky seems to hope, a diplomatic resolution by the end of the year, it seems inevitable that will somehow involve NATO or European or some troops on the ground in Ukraine. I can't imagine that Zelensky, given that none of this would have happened if 30 years ago Ukraine had not agreed to give up the Soviet nuclear weapons that it had, which was supposed to happen in exchange for the West guaranteeing its security. That was the deal. Clearly, that deal did not work out very well for Ukraine. So I can't imagine Zelensky, in the wake of that, making a deal that did not involve more than just saying yes, we'll help you if Russia decides to invade again. There needs to be a physical presence, and I think it's a foregone conclusion the United States is not going to be that physical presence, at least not to any great degree. And is that something? From your perspective, I know that's been batted around. I know a lot in the UK, as well as in the EU, and it's not clear to me that is something that everybody would support. What does it look like to you?
It looks like Starmer and various EU leaders will try to dress up that kind of peacekeeping stroke enforcement role as a kind of victory for Ukraine, even if it means a pretty grubby, unpleasant partition, which looks increasingly likely. I do wonder what form this could take, though, whether it will be within NATO or whether it will be kind of on the basis of individual EU member states in the UK, say, putting together a peace force, as it were, and sending it to Ukraine outside the official auspices of NATO. That's obviously a very strange scenario, but it's plausible given that at the end of this process, NATO may be redundant or irrelevant, frankly, given the US position. And I can imagine the next British Prime Minister, because it's looking like Starmer's on his way out, can imagine them playing the same game of trying to sell it to the public as a great victory or some kind of necessary means of securing Ukrainian security.
It probably it seems. I mean, I would not weep at the idea of NATO going the way of the dodo. It strikes me as an archaic institution, and one whose parameters don't make, to my mind, a lot of sense. And I think Europe would be better off in general, with each country, or even collectively, be it through the European Commission or simply through various bilateral agreements, but each country handling its own defense, and being capable of doing that without looking to the United States. That is, I think that's going to become very important, because I suspect, Trump has come, Trump will go, but the United States is a declining power, and its increasing reliance on its military reach is not healthy for anyone. It's not healthy for us here. It's not healthy for the rest of the world. And I think that, if Europe in particular and European countries individually can enhance their own defense without relying on the United States, outside of, the United States, I'm sure will always be the world's biggest arms dealer. I can't see that going away. But other than that, you buy the weapons here, but you do with them as you see fit, as it were. I think that's probably it'll be a short-term issue, but I think in the long term, it'll be much better for everyone concerned, even though I know that for a lot of people, the idea of rearming Europe brings certain uncomfortable historical parallels, but the system we have now is not healthy, and I think it needs, this America-centric security system, if you will, is not one that's going to be workable in the long term. So, and the sooner Europe and other countries around the world get out, start weaning themselves off of that system, I think the better.
Yeah, if things had gone very differently in the 90s, all of this would look very differently, wouldn't it? It would potentially be much better if NATO had been wrapped up and we forged some kind of, speaking very abstractly, some kind of like mutual security agreement with Russia that guarantees neutrality and autonomy for all these former Eastern Bloc states. But you can't turn back the clock, and here we are.
Yeah, we didn't do that, and in fact, that was what was, I think, was supposed to happen. At least in many minds at that time, as I recall it. You know, I was younger then, but still dealing with sort of this stuff. Showing my age very badly here, but it was a period where we had, and this was really mostly on the United States. We had the opportunity to really chart a new course of a powerful international system that was based on law and order, based on cooperation, and really tried to minimize conflict. And instead, we tried to, turn the former Soviet Union into as much of a oligarchical moneymaker as we could, and that did not turn out well. While there was no explicit treaty or any agreement about NATO not expanding eastward, it was understood, and people may forget this now, but it was understood at the time. I was there. I remember it. It was understood at the time that was part of where we were going. That was what was intended, and the United States abandoned that almost immediately. Many people, I think, downplay that aspect and say that has nothing to do with why Putin invaded. And again, whether it does or doesn't is in no way a justification of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But to try and absolve the West of all responsibility for getting us where we are right now, I think is equally short-sighted and equally foolish and equally incorrect. That NATO expansion did help bring us to this place, as many people at the time, both progressive and very conservative thinkers said that it would, and it turned out they were right.
Yeah, on the point of explanation as justification, as we could frame it, the idea that by providing a historical analysis of the factors that leads to a conflict, you're in some way excusing the decision making. People should think more about their history on this. Ironically, look at the most notorious example in European history. Look at Nazi Germany. We know from the historical record the impact of the Versailles Treaty after the First World War, what that meant for the emergence of the Weimar Republic, what it meant for its economy and society, how that ultimately led to the emergence of the Nazis, and so on. That's not to justify the invasion of Poland.
Right.
It's possible to have a historical account which doesn't say, and therefore it was fine.
Right.
God forbid we actually talk about these things with some clarity.
Yeah, I mean, and we should be able to look at the mistakes we've made in the past, so that we, not that we don't repeat them. That's not that for sure, but also so that we learn from them and how to make better plans, which we don't seem to be doing very much of right now.
Yeah, maybe it's going to be a theme of this podcast that Western nations have no sense of strategy or direction.
Probably unavoidable.
Yeah. Yeah, that's all for this week. Thanks for listening. This has been Globalists.